Maybe history has some lessons about that. We have.
Okay.
So we should be live on Facebook in one moment, and Rabbi Fisher, I'm gonna.
I see that we are already live. Look at that. Now here comes. Thank you for waiting patiently, everybody. If you are on this call, you are getting a behind-the-scenes look at what it looks like just before people start a Zoom meeting. You are the lucky chosen few. So now let me see how savvy you are. Did you tag me in the Facebook link to go live on Facebook?
Well, that was what I was about to do now.
Very good. Always,
you're a step ahead of me here, Rabbi Fishman.
I knew you wouldn't miss a beat.
Okay, so we are.
And then I will, I'll put that on my Facebook wall as well. And then I think we can begin.
Once it's on Facebook, then it's official.
It's okay. It's still 12:33. No Jewish event ever began less than 5 minutes late. So,
okay, Rabbi Fishman, I believe you are now tagged on Facebook. So that should make it official.
There you go. It's there.
It's there in real life. Wow.
I am here. I think we are ready.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, whether you're here on Facebook or on Zoom. And a really tremendous Hakar Tov to Rabbi Mark Fishman, who is my friend and mentor. Rabbi Fishman, I thought we might just start with a quick introduction to each other, given we've known each other for quite some time, but some of the people here with us have not, or may only know one of us. So maybe standing on one foot, we can each introduce ourselves and our communities.
Absolutely. I thought you were asking me to introduce you for a second, but yes, go for it.
No, you please, you first.
My name is Rabbi Mark Fishman. I'm originally from London, England. I am the rabbi at Congregation Beth Tikva in Montreal, Canada.
Beautiful. And hi, everyone. My name is Rabbi Gershon Albert, a rabbi of Beth Jacob Congregation in Oakland, California, just outside of San Francisco. And I know Rabbi Fishman because before either of us were rabbis, but Rabbi Fishman was already well on his way to being a rabbi. I was a high schooler, and I met Rabbi Fishman together with my twin brother, and he tutored us in Talmud. I think that we must have been 14 or 15 years old at the time. And my brother and I had just been growing in our observance and were interested in studying and didn't really have the tools or the access to Talmud. I see one of my former teachers, Maura Rosenek here, who I think thanks to Maura Rosenek that I learned how to read Rashi and Tanakh. Welcome, it's great to have you. But Rabbi Fishman was the first person who I studied Mishnah and Talmud with, and also the first person who I heard the name Rabbi Jonathan Sachs from. And we had been in touch for years in Montreal, and then reconnected when I joined Rabbi Fishman in the rabbinate, and we started attending conferences together. And it's an honor to be here together. So thank you again, Rabbi Fishman. As people might tell from your accent, you did not grow up on this continent, but instead in England. And I wanted to just start with a personal question of if you can tell us about the influence that Rabbi Sachs has had on you in your personal life and the experiences you had together with him.
Sure. First of all, let me say what an honor, before we even begin, let me just say what an honor it is to be here with you. As you just mentioned, we met when you were about 14, 15. And I have to tell you, it was actually a life-changing experience. I was just discussing this with my wife earlier when I was talking about coming online with you. And I said that at that time, I was in Montreal. My wife was studying for her PhD, and I was attending a kollel, a institution of higher Talmudic learning. And I actually was exceptionally lonely. And I did not have a social circle. I knew nobody. And an opportunity came about through a complete stranger who said, would you like to tutor and give additional supplemental Talmudic learning to a younger student. They're twins, actually. And at that point in my life, I felt like I'm at rock bottom. I have nothing else to lose. Sure, I'll throw in my hat with two strangers. And I have to tell you that it was an amazing moment, because not only was it a turning point for me in being able to stop looking inwards the whole time and feel so sorry for myself that I was alone and lonely and didn't know anyone, but rather it was and we were able to not only learn with each other, but also to form and forge a relationship that amazingly has continued over the years. And I think it was 2005 when we first met, 2006 plus minus.
Yeah.
With that's 15 years. That's a long time. That's a long time for anything.
Well, I have to say, there's more I could say, but only miktzat shvacho shel adam lefanav, only sharing a little bit of the praise that I would have for Rabbi Fishman. But seeing you as a model, when my brother and I were kind of dipping our toes into observant Judaism, and there was seeing you as a model of someone who was deeply committed to study and to observance, but was also rooted in the world that I recognized from my own childhood, what I later came to know was the world of modern Orthodoxy, and really, in many ways, the world of Rabbi Sachs that you grew up with and grew through, was really impactful for both my brother and I. And when we reconnected a few years later, when you were in rabbinical school in Israel and I was a young yeshiva student there, you continued to kind of make a mark on my life, sometimes from a distance, of being a model of modern Orthodoxy, which influenced the path that I took as well. And so thank you for that.
I feel very humbled. I really do. And I have goosebumps being here with you right now. And I'm so proud of you and all of your accomplishments.
Thank you.
Let me pick up on the very last thing that you just said, which was that Rabbi Sachs was a model of modern Orthodoxy. And I know this is slightly different than the question that you just asked me originally. But I want to share with you an answer that Rabbi Sachs gave 3-4 years ago, approximately, when he was visiting Israel in the yeshiva of Eretz Tzvi, a popular post-high school yeshiva in Israel. And I actually told this story in my shul on Shabbat. And it was brought to my attention by Rabbi Alex Israel, a Londoner originally, who now teaches in the various different academic institutions in Jerusalem. And he told the following story, and I think it's very insightful. One of the students turned to Rabbi Sachs, who was giving a question and answer session with these post-high school Anglo-speaking American yeshiva students. And one of the kids asked, Rabbi Sachs, you are the leader of modern Orthodoxy. You're the spokesperson for modern Orthodoxy. What advice do you have for us as the leader of modern Orthodoxy today? And Rabbi Sachs responded by saying, I am not the leader of modern Orthodoxy. I do not see myself as the spokesperson for modern Orthodoxy. Now, the students were all floored and somewhat flabbergasted at this response, because if anyone was the spokesperson for that type of Orthodoxy, who else but Rabbi Sachs? And they said, what do you mean? Like, how does that even make sense? And he said that my goal is to see myself. This is actually last week's parasha, Chayei Sarah. If you take a look at the exchange when Abraham tries to buy a burial plot for his deceased wife, Sarah, he will purchase the cave of Machpelah from the children of Chet, the Bnei Chet, as they are referred to. And when he approaches them, they already know of his fame, they already know of his standing and stature, and they say to him, Nasi Elokim ata b'tochinu, you are a prince of God in our midst. And he said, if I have been able to try and strive to achieve any type of title, it will be to strive towards being a Nasi Elokim ata b'tochinu, a prince of God in our midst. And he said, and let me explain to you why. He said, I would never define myself as a leader of modern Orthodoxy or even as being modern Orthodox, for the simple reason that I would be pigeonholing myself into a minority of a minority of a minority. And it's such a classic Sachs thing to say, and he explained as follows. He said, Jews are a minority of the world's population. We currently take up 0.5% of the world's total population. Number two, of all of the Jews in the world, Orthodox Jews are a minority in the global Jewish world. And number three, if you look at Orthodoxy, modern Orthodox Jews are a minority within Orthodox Jews. So he said, why would I want to see myself as a minority of a minority of a minority? And he said, just last month, I was privileged to speak at Emory University on stage in conversation with the Dalai Lama in front of 20,000 people, speaking about God, speaking about religion, speaking about faith. Do you think for a second I would have been given such a platform if I would be looked upon as the leader of modern Orthodox Judaism? He said, the goal is always to be Nasi Elokim Ata B'tochenu, a prince of God in our midst. And he says, my goal has always been to allow the Torah and the light of Judaism to shine as brightly as it can be. And this story encapsulates for me a very important fundamental in Jewish belief. We tend to box ourselves into categories. And it's a complicated story. It starts in the 18th century with the adjectival Jew, as Rabbi Sachs points out in his book, One People. People were just Jews previously. Now we become Reform Jews, Orthodox Jews, conservative Jews, ultra-Orthodox, Haredi Jews, modern Zionist Jews. The adjectival Jew is a modern phenomenon. And previously, there was simply Judaism's interaction with the world. In the paradigm of Abraham and Sarah, the first ever Jews, and that was to bring blessing to the world. In the opening passages of Jewish time, God informs the reader in the Torah that he's choosing Abraham because he will instruct his children and his household after him to follow the way of God in righteousness and in a path of meaning. And through you will the families of the earth be blessed. Our mission statement was to bring blessing to the families of the earth. We are not playing small, we're shooting for the stars. We are trying to raise the entire planet to its ultimate redemption, to its fulfillment, to everything that it can be. And we shouldn't play small by putting ourselves into a box. I define my Judaism this way, but not this way, with a little bit of this and 10% of that. And occasionally I get out my guitar and I'm 5% of this. There's the light of God, the light of Torah. And it's authentic and it's real. That doesn't mean that there's one approach. There's multiple approaches. But what spoke to me so powerfully about Rabbi Sachs was how he authentically presented what he just saw as Judaism, as Torah.
Yeah. And I mean, that sense of expansiveness, I was thinking of the expression in Tehillim and Psalms of Anani b'merchavya, God, answer me. I feel like I'm in a place of constraint, answer me from a place of expansiveness. And it seems to have defined so much of Rabbi Sachs's writing and who he was. I think in many ways, it's also had an impact on you and I. We've both selected and been privileged to function in rabbinates where we are Orthodox rabbis who serve a much broader community. And I was trying to think as we were preparing for today, what are the defining characteristics of what Rabbi Sachs did? And he wrote dozens of books, but the ones that I think might have the most reach, just that were published the most likely, were his translation of the Siddur, the Koren Sachs Siddur, and then the various Machzorim for the high holidays and other festivals. And I started to think of Rabbi Sachs as a translator of Judaism, of someone who took these eternal values and just made them so incredibly accessible and broad. And he didn't only translate a Siddur for a new generation, but really translated Judaism for a new generation. I think you may have mentioned this in a post you wrote. I find myself really moved by Maimonides, by the Rambam, and the work that he undertook in the Moreh Nevuchim and the Guide of the Perplexed, where he found himself living in a intellectual milieu, in a context where Jews were being drawn to Aristotelian philosophy and to Greek philosophy through this revival that it had in the Arab countries where he was living in the early medieval period. And the Rambam undertook a mission of basically saying, well, Judaism has something to say to this intellectual world. And that's where the God of the Perplexed came from. And I think in many ways, Rabbi Sacks, probably in the last 20 years, did this more than any other Jewish thinker that I can consider. And I guess he was doing it for longer than that, but that's just when I became familiar with him, where he really took Judaism and explained how relevant it is, and not only how relevant, but how important it is for the broader society around us. So given that we're both rabbis who've chosen that kind of mission of being Orthodox rabbis in our own practice and our own faith, but who believe in serving a broader community, I'm curious to ask you, how has that part of Rabbi Sacks's legacy influenced your own rabbinate?
That's an amazing question. Thank you. Thank you. There's a few thoughts that I have. I'll try to structure them coherently. When I was leaving my rabbinical school, somebody once told me that the most important line that you will ever see written in all of Judaism is the line that many synagogues have over their ark. I see that you have a backdrop. Move your head to the left a little bit. You don't have it in yours. You don't have it in yours. They do have it at Beth Tikva. It's a very, very popular line. It says, Da lifnei mi ata omed. Know before whom you stand. This is very, very popular in many synagogues. Not all, many synagogues have this line. And it's about reverence. It's about knowing that you're in a shul, don't talk, behave appropriately, know before whom you stand. So when I was graduating rabbinical school, a very insightful individual came up to me and he said, this is the most important line that you will ever see. But he says, don't think about it as far as God. It's not speaking only about know before whom you stand, God. You have to think about it when you turn with your back now to the ark and you're facing out into your congregation. Know before whom you stand. And that one line, in many ways, encapsulates what Rabbi Sacks was so successful at. He knew his audience. As has been pointed out by others, I think it was a process of him working very hard on himself to reach that point. Remember, he was a philosophy genius in his early 20s. And when you take a philosophy genius, they're some of the hardest people to speak to. And certainly some of the hardest people to understand. No one understands philosophy students. I'm not even sure philosophy students understand themselves.
And by the way, you were a philosophy student.
I was a philosophy
you're
student.
Talking about yourself here.
Yeah, for my sins. But philosophy students, they're complex, complicated people, and their sentences can run on for many paragraphs with clauses and conditions. And I remember a story I was reading where one of the colleagues of Rabbi Sacks, I believe somebody who was a contemporary of his, attended one of his first lectures in Jews College when he was there, and approached Rabbi Sacks after the lecture. It was on Torah and Wittgenstein, I believe. And he said to him a comment in Yiddish, to which Rabbi Sacks said, I'm sorry, I do not understand you. I don't speak Yiddish. To which the person responded back, well, now you know how I have just felt for the last hour and a half. and people didn't understand. He was up here. He was in the astrosphere. People didn't understand him. And he learned through working on himself to speak to the language of the masses. Now, initially, that was a language, and all throughout actually, of modern philosophy and sociology. In fact, just this morning, I was having a conversation with my dearly beloved friend and teacher, Rabbi Gideon Sylvester, And he has penned an article for the Jewish Chronicle. This is the British Jewish newspaper. Am I allowed to say this? It's being published tomorrow. Am I allowed to give you a hot off the press? Okay, don't tell anybody. This is appearing in tomorrow's newspaper.
Right. Only in the confines of the Zoom room and whoever might be on Facebook.
Right. The editorial staff at the Jewish Chronicle will be upset with me now. But Rabbi Gideon Sylvester writes in tomorrow's newspaper that Rabbi Sachs took the language, just like you said, of the common masses from a sociological point, from a historical point, from a philosophical point, and he used that to be his language to explain Judaism. Because in a secular age, in a cynical time, to take especially some of the most delicate topics that Judaism believes in, it is a tough challenge indeed to be able to put that into the language that people can listen to. And so often, the success of teachers, rabbis, educators is not in the message. The Torah's message is there. It's in the medium. Can we deliver through the correct way and articulate exactly what that message is? And by the way, I have to add, as well as being a genius and as well as couching his Judaism in philosophy, sociology, psychology, game theory, mathematics, he was someone who knew the common man in the street to such a degree that he was able to put his ideas into pop culture too. Yeah. And it should be noted, and it wasn't because this was pragmatic, he just was so broad that he encapsulated within him everything. And I want to go on record and say, and this is a direct quote from him, he knew all of the words to Hamilton. He knew all of the words to Hamilton. He loved Hamilton. And it wasn't because this would be a great technical way that I could slip in Judaism to, he knew who he was speaking to. And that's why the masses, not just the Jewish world or the Orthodox world, but the non-Orthodox world, the non-religious world, the federations across North America. Have you ever seen an outpouring for a rabbi who has died? Have you ever even heard of the federations of North America acknowledging a rabbi who dies? I don't think I have. And yet this federations of North America, he was able to speak the pop culture language of the streets today. And that's what made him so successful as well.
Right. There's an apocryphal story, and you're probably in a better position to say if it's true or not, that Rabbi Sachs approached Disney to create the movie known as The Prince of Egypt, to tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of Exodus from Egypt.
I cannot speak to that. I don't know.
Okay. I've heard it. I can't share a source for it. And that kind of,
although
again,
if I may, if you do look at the end credits of The Prince of Egypt, it does say with special thanks to a team of rabbis. So okay. Yeah, but now I'm just showing you where my headspace is at. I'm watching Disney movies or the credits of Disney movies.
Right, because I'm still in like the toddler nursery rhyme stage of pop culture consumption right now. I've been thinking about the influence of Rabbi Sachs and how for so many of us it was through his written word. For me, I read Rabbi Sachs before I heard Rabbi Sachs, before I saw Rabbi Sachs. I think the first time I saw him, he had just finished his tenure as the chief rabbi of England, and he spent, I believe it was a semester at first, in New York City between New York University and Yeshiva University. And I was in Smicha in rabbinical school at the time, and I got to hear him speak in person. And his presence was amazing when he got up to speak. It was a really remarkable experience to just feel his presence in a room. But you've had many more experiences to be in a room with Rabbi Sachs, and I wonder if you can share maybe a few anecdotes from those experiences growing up and coming of age in England. I know you traveled many hours to spend time with him and to learn from him in person. If you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. I was studying at Manchester University at a time when Rabbi Sachs was offering a series of public lectures in London. And I had read his book, One People, which is actually a dense halachic sociological book. It changed my life. And people ask me what was the one book that was. I'm not sure I recommend it to everybody, because it's advanced reading. It's looking at the parameters of Orthodox theology and Orthodox practice from the perspective of pluralism. It's fascinating and a very important book, but it's actually a dense halachic book. After reading that book, my life was changed, and I became along my own Jewish journey to find out more, to learn more, to grow in my Judaism, practice and knowledge. And during the period of time at Manchester, I would actually get on the train back to London to go and hear his lectures. This completely confused my housemates that I was living with at the time, because they were actually not going down the road to go to their own lectures, because they had other important agendas that they wanted to fulfill. And I was getting on a train going back to London to go to a lecture, and they were looking at me like I'd fallen off the moon. But in those lectures, he was electrifying. There was a couple of hundred people filling an auditorium, and he spoke for about 2 hours. These were long, complex lectures, peppered with humor, with anecdotes, with powerful stories, and touching on philosophy, and it set my soul on fire. And I remember just being able to kind of grab a conversation here and there with him, where he was able to give you a short period of time, yet it felt like he was giving you all of the time in the world. And he took you seriously. And the questions that you would share with him were of the most greatest importance that there could be at that time. And I remember these were the questions of a 18, 19, 20-year-old, still trying to understand the most basic ideas and elements. And yet to him, there was nothing more important. And I recall that on one occasion, he was extremely open with me. I asked him about a particular book, and he said that he had showed that book in a draft form to a Reform colleague of his. And the Reform colleague had actually ripped it to shreds. And he rewrote the entire book in a couple of weeks, because he felt that he didn't want to cause hurt or offense. So he kept his singular principle, but then rewrote the work from a different perspective. Yeah. And I want to share something else on this subject of openness to his students. I don't want to pull the wool over people's eyes and come across as an exceptionally close student. I don't think I was. I had opportunities where I could speak to him one-on-one. I had moments where we had email and letter correspondence with each other. But I don't consider myself part of an inner circle, so to speak. But I want you to know, and I'm really one of thousands, but I want you to know that his greatness rested in the fact that he always made time for students. He always made time for young adults. And there was no greater love in his life, there was no greater pleasure in his life than in being able to take young adults seriously and to answer their questions and to help inspire them and set them on a goal. He is so famous for quoting the line about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, good leaders make followers, great leaders make leaders. But what needs to be said is how that was not a throwaway line for him. That statement characterized his entire career all the way to the end. And this is so important. Allow me, I know I'm speaking quite lengthy to your answers. I've only got 6 more hours of material to get through. So I thank all of our listeners for their patience. But I really want to stress that in our world today, when a person is great, when a person becomes big, when a person becomes famous, they get access. They get access. And I'm someone with no access. I'm sure you have lots of access, but I have no access. When you are on a meteoric rise to superstardom, you get all of the access available. This was a person that was invited to Buckingham Palace repeatedly. if you remember when Prince Harry was, I don't know if you remember that, about 10 years ago, he went through a naughty stage. Let's make its way over to North America.
I
And he
think
was like,
the tabloids are not quite as strong as on the other side of the
right. So oh
Atlantic,
my
but
gosh, British tabloids and the royals. So Prince Harry dressed up at a Halloween party, and on his arm, he wore a armband with the symbol of a Nazi swastika on it. And the British tabloids ripped him to shreds. It was interviewing former prisoners of war. It interviewed British heroic soldiers, Jewish Holocaust survivors, and third to the throne is now walking around at a fancy dress party with a Nazi symbol. Who did Buckingham Palace call to speak to Prince Harry? It wasn't his father, Prince Charles. And this was after Diana had died. They didn't know who was the right person, not to give him a telling off, but someone who he would be able to listen to, someone that could get through to him. They actually asked Rabbi Sachs to come in and speak to Prince Harry over his behavior. So it wasn't that he had you've got a once in a lifetime opportunity to be invited to Buckingham Palace. No. He was on speed dial at Buckingham Palace. Our kid is acting out again. You need to come and talk to him. Like I mentioned before, the Dalai Lama, 10 Downing Street, a series of British prime ministers, a series of Archbishop of Canterbury's. He was interviewing just recently Bill and Melinda Gates for the Gates Foundation, the head of Google. He had access to everybody. He wrote Vice President Mike Pence's speech when he came to speak in the Knesset of Israel. So this individual had access. So what happens usually, to the greater degree that you have more access in the world, what happens? You have little to no time for the small people. Why? Because ego. Some student is emailing me, forget it, like a pisher. I'll send my secretary to palm them off with unfortunately at this time I'm invited to Buckingham Palace. I'm invited to the Knesset. I need to be speaking on a TED Talk. That's what usually happens. And the greater access you have, the less time you have for small people. He never stopped showing a passionate interest in 18-year-old kids, in 20-year-old young adults, in students that had a burning desire and passion to be able to go out and make a difference. And we know, and you were exactly like this when I met you, this burning, passionate ideology of, I want to make a difference to the Jewish world. I want to be able to set souls on fire. I feel impassioned and inspired. Let me share that with others. That is the most amazing quality that young adults have. He never lost his ability to take those periods seriously and make the time. That's what's even more amazing. He made the time for those young nobodies, notwithstanding the fact that he was in demand by the most important people in the world.
That's absolutely incredible. I'm actually going to have to, as we're balancing this, my wife and I double booked our mornings. So I'm going to be taking one or two of my own young people and trying to continue moderating. But before I do that, in the midst of doing that, I want to maybe shift to maybe some chavruta thinking about some of the most important ideas that Rabbi Sachs stood for and embodied in his writing and in his life. And you mentioned that idea of kind of giving himself to others and building great leaders, which for me is a manifestation of just the great importance he believed in character and in morality and in selflessness. I believe I once heard him tell a story, and it might have been when I heard him speak at Yeshiva University. I tried finding a transcript of it. I only found a version of the story he wrote without any names associated with it. But the way I remember hearing the story was that when he was a young student in university, he was confused and unsure about what his direction in life should be, whether he should go into academia or the rabbinate. And he wrote a letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, if I understand correctly, who he viewed as really a mentor and probably one of the great Jewish leader of the last 100 years in terms of creating access and expansiveness. And he wrote the Lubavitcher Rebbe a letter saying like, I don't know what the right direction is for me. I don't know if I should go into academic studies or if I should become a rabbi. And the response he said he got from the Lubavitcher Rebbe was just a return envelope with the exact letter that he wrote. And the only thing in the letter was just every time he had used the word I, it was circled in red. And that was the response. And he went on to say that the lesson he learned from that is that in order to figure out what your purpose is in the world, it's really not about you. It's about what impact you can have on others. And for me, that speaks to the importance of morality and selflessness in the thought and the life of Rabbi Sachs. I wonder if maybe you can elaborate for yourself what that means for you, and what do you think that means for our communities, the value of not putting yourself first and thinking about the bigger picture, and that all you do should be towards a greater end.
Beautiful. Thank you. And by the way, if you need to run and get a kid on your lap or whatever the case may be, this is a conversation among friends. So it's all good. Do what you've got to do. I remember that story. I don't believe it was Rabbi Sachs who wrote that particular letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I believe it was a chassid of the Lubavitcher Rebbe who wrote that letter. And
I know he's quoted the story.
That's correct. I believe the story is found in his book From Optimism to Hope. And what he points out there is that in his earlier life, the Lubavitcher Rebbe was actually a book editor. And one of the techniques in the editing of books is actually to have its own internal shorthand. And you can imagine the quantity of pages that need to be gotten through, and you wouldn't be writing out in a longhand all of the edits and corrections. There is actually a symbol that switches the word I to you. And so the Lubavitcher Rebbe, when writing back to this Lubavitcher Chassid, exactly as you said, I am dissatisfied, I am lonely, I am feeling worried, I am not getting as many friends as he put this symbol next to the word I on each time to switch it to you. Can you switch, instead of I am worried about, can you be worried about others? And that is, I believe, the origin of that story. What the import of that story is, and this is spoken about in his most latest book, Morality, is that we have become a very inward and I-centered society. This is the great fear of what will be the thin edge of thin edge of the slippery slope of what will be the future of Western society. And Rabbi Sachs was particularly concerned and worried about the world as a whole, and in particular, the great experiment of human liberty and freedom that is called the United States of America, and the political civic society of America, Europe as a whole. And he, in my reading of his books, believed that as we became a more I-centered society, we were losing the social bonds that connected us all together. Why we are turning into an I society, you have to read the book's Morality. The Home We Build Together is also a key text, looking at it from the perspective of England specifically. Morality is looking at it from America more so. And technology is a component of this. Social media is a component of this. The changes in our morality are a key function of this. And pleasure-driven principles are a function of this. And taken all together, what's happening is that we're losing the bonds of what tie us to one another.
Yeah.
And that might be fine when we just want to shut out the world and watch Netflix and lie on our beds and update our Instagram profiles. And a lot of the time, a lot of people are engaged in those activities. I want to lie on my bed, watch Netflix, and simultaneously update my Instagram profile. But life isn't only made of those moments. Life is made of moments of great celebration. Life is made of moments of triumph and rite of passage, a baby naming, a bar mitzvah, a wedding, a coming together for a graduation. There are moments of real celebration, and a person celebrating alone is not really going to be celebrating. We tap into shared joy when we're around other people. And that's absolutely true, if not more so, when we come to not celebration, but mourning, mourning, and we can't mourn alone. Process of shiva, process of burial. We are a community-orientated religion, and human beings, as he argues, are in need of friendship, in need of community. So what happens when that disappears? Now, this is going to be a massive question for synagogues post-COVID.
Yeah.
That's a whole different conversation. Maybe in 6 months we'll do this again, and that will be our subject.
I think you're already the synagogue without walls, right?
Right.
That's your
one
motto.
possible solution. But what does it look like? Not just for houses of worship post the pandemic, but what does it look? I mean, there was already a trajectory for houses of worship. What does it look like for us in our world today when we've lost community, when we've lost the shared bonds of what brings us together, when we celebrate and we mourn alone? And that's a very fearful, worrisome moment in the West.
I was thinking, I went through some of the classes and lectures that I've given where I've quoted Rabbi Sacks and tried to think, what were the things that influenced me the most? And you're the scholar of Rabbi Sacks here, having read all of his books. I did the Am Haaretz, the simpleton's approach to Rabbi Sacks throughout my rabbinate of taking his articles and his website and his Siddur and Machzor commentaries. That's most of what I've read from him. I've read some of his books, but not most of his books. And one thing that stood out to me was from his Machzor commentary for Sukkot, where he talks about Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, as this failed character. And he basically diagnoses Kohelet's unhappiness with exactly that story that we were talking about before, about the I that has to be turned to the you. And he writes on the Machzor, Kohelet's failure to find meaning is directly related to his obsession with the I and the me. I built for myself, I gathered for myself, I acquired for myself. And the more he pursues his desires, the emptier his life becomes, which is such a powerful critique of Kohelet, but really of all of us living in a Western world where the I becomes the main focus of what we're told a meaningful life is. I'm curious, in your reading of Rabbi Sacks, what do you think the medication is? What do you think the healing is for that diagnosis of an I-focused society?
I think Rabbi Sacks himself gives the answer, the medication for an I-focused society, and he does so in his introduction to the book To Heal a Shattered World.
Yeah.
And he says something so simple. He says Judaism is a religion of many different beliefs, and we have conflicting beliefs and conflicting philosophical systems, and there is great complicated work to be done in understanding Maimonides. And when a person looks at what Judaism believes in, they can find themselves in a maze that is hard to ever escape from. And he actually goes on to say that people can believe many different things in Judaism, and that's okay. Of course, there are certain red lines, but he says there's many differences for an approach to theology. But then he says, when it comes to Jewish practice, Judaism is really simple. If you see someone that's hungry, give them food. If you see someone that's lonely, invite them over. If you see the naked, clothe them. If you see the brokenhearted, cheer them up. He says this is Jewish practice at its most simplest. And I think that in Rabbi Sacks's writings, he is urging the antidote to an I society, returning back to a we society, as simply realizing to go beyond ourselves, to go outside of ourselves. And it's not complicated. It's actually simple. It's as simple could be. Feed the hungry, clothe the poor, and warm the spirits of the brokenhearted. And I'm sure you have experienced this as much as I have. I'm sure you have realized that in the last 8 months, there have been the greatest truisms reminded to rabbis and community-orientated leaders that making a phone call and reaching out to somebody has incredible depth and power to it, the likes of which 100 sermons could never accomplish.
It's a hard thing for the rabbi's ego to acknowledge that. In many ways, I think we as rabbis have been reminded of that when the average attendance of a sermon has dropped significantly. I don't know if you found that, but I used to have a bully pulpit where people would show up on a Saturday morning and I could talk for 200 in front of 200 people. And now, I'm honored that there are people here on Facebook and on our Zoom room now, but it's been a humbling experience and really a reminder of, right, that it's the simple things like Isaiah says, like, don't think that you're so great and that your offerings mean so much to God if you're not willing to actually take care of the people in need in the moments that they have their needs. And I think that's it's such a simple but fundamental antidote, as you said. I was thinking, you talked about Rabbi Sacks is like how he really forces us to think outside of ourselves. And one other area where I think Rabbi Sacks did this in an incredibly powerful way would be around interfaith conversations and work, and how much he was focused on talking beyond the Jewish world. And we've mentioned that in passing. The first book that I bought from Rabbi Sacks, I have a copy of it here. It's hard to see with my fake background, is The Dignity of Difference, which he wrote after 9/11. And he had diagnosed for himself, to himself, that if religion was the cause of violent extremism in the world, then religion also had to be the cure and the antidote for violent extremism in the world. And I think that's where this book came out. The subtitle is How to Avoid the Clash of Civilization. And I found it incredible how much reach he had beyond, not just to the secular public, right? Not just in Buckingham Palace. I understand the Anglican Church, it has its seat there too, but particularly in how he reached out to other religions. There was an article that I quoted a few years ago. I quoted it because I found it so powerful, where he wrote an article called "The Road Less Traveled" in the Islamic Monthly, where he talked about how any religion and all the major religions, including the three Abrahamic faiths, all have a violent streak within them and have all been capable of invoking violence against others. And how now is a moment, I think he wrote the article in conjunction with Not in God's Name, where he was really responding to religious extremism. And he talks about how if we don't make religion into a healing force in the world, then two things are going to happen. One, religion is going to be a thing of the past broadly. And two, the world is going to be a much more violent and broken place because religion can heal the world. And for me, that's just such an incredible message that he was offering, when so many other rabbinic leaders are focused on only the growth of Judaism. He was also thinking about, well, how can Judaism in a really direct way be an Or L'Goyim, be that light to the nations, and that brings us outside of ourselves. Did you have any experiences in that kind of interfaith work, either in the readings you've done from Rabbi Sacks or in conversations you've had with him?
My interactions with him were not based on an interfaith perspective. so much of my growth and my personal learning was done at the same time as I was reading his books and articles and attending his lectures. However, since being in the rabbinate, interfaith work is a key part of my work here, and to realize that there can be a time where we have with our co-religionists of other faiths moments where what we share together is so much more powerful than what divides us. I have been always encouraged and buoyed by Rabbi Sacks's beliefs of wanting to bring this message of faith to the entire world. I think Rabbi Sacks saw the big picture, and so often we get caught in the trees, not being able to see the forest. We can get so caught up in the minutiae that we forget what we're even doing in the first place. And this is true in every field of life, but how doubly tragic it is to get caught up in the trees and not to take in the entire forest, when the very project of Judaism is the betterment of the entire world and the betterment of society. Yeah. And to focus narrowly or internally or inwardly, or to make the focus of one's time to be on the minutiae. I think there's a time and a place for that. I think we have certain scholars within our own tradition who you give me all of the laws of sit, the ritual fringes that people, they could write books and books on the laws of sit. They know everything about sit. They are the world's expert in sit. And that always leaves me with this sense of saying, okay, that's great. And I will never know that much about sit in my life.
Yeah.
But is that the thrust? Is that the path? Is this what we are trying to achieve? And it was bringing God into this world. And what that meant to Rabbi Sacks was the beauty of each human being as having an innate dignity of creating a world with a little less roughness around the edges. That is what he was striving to create. And he realized that he had a voice that could be listened to.
Yeah, as we're kind of bring this really meaningful conversation to a close, I've been thinking about the moments in my life when Rabbi Sacks's voice was so powerful in it, and just in my own personal religious journey, having grown up in a very multicultural secular society in Montreal that well, because I think you also ended up teaching in some of the schools that I was part of before being the rabbi of Beth Tikva. So I went to public school, and in my religious journey, I kind of came into a world where the laws of tzitzit was a huge focus, just to use your anecdote. And it's something that I find compelling and beautiful and true. I've spent, like you, many years studying Talmud and the codes of Shulchan Aruch and the commentaries. And I always just, whenever I got too deep in that, I almost had this anxiety of it was an anxiety caused by how myopic that could be if it was kept in isolation. And what I think Rabbi Sacks did so powerfully for me was give me language to think about how those particular parts of Judaism could be an expression of a much broader whole. And it brings me to my last theme for what Rabbi Sacks meant to me, which was the balance of universalism and particularism, and how Rabbi Sacks never viewed our particular Jewish journey in isolation from the rest of the world. And the thing I've found most powerful, and it's really been an engine for so much of what I've tried to do, is that the universalism is a value that we hold dear, and our Jewish faith should translate into the world around us really in every way. And yet, if we only hold on to universalism, and if that's our only ideal, it becomes so ethereal. Maybe in Kohelet's language, again, it becomes havel. It becomes just like air that you can't hold on to. And one passage from Rabbi Sacks that I've held on to for years, it's in the Dignity of Difference, is that the universality is the moral concern that we should all have, but we don't learn how to be a moral person in the universal context until we learn it in a particular context. When we're teaching our children to be nice people, we don't teach them to be nice people to every single stranger on the street first. First, we start by saying, be nice to your parents, be nice to your siblings. We start in a really small context, in that particular context, and we hope that the values we learn there and we practice there then translate and become more and more applied more expansively. And that thinking from Rabbi Sachs has just given me so much faith in the tension of, again, believing in this project of orthodoxy and in a commitment to Torah and halacha, but at the same time not getting lost, as you said, in the trees. That has been a really deep, powerful comfort and inspiration for me in the work that I've tried to do. Curious, I think you more than many other people I know, most other people I know.
That's really beautiful. I'm very inspired to hear you say all of that.
Well, I think you more than many others I know have really lived that legacy of Rabbi Sachs of thinking beyond the box. I think your synagogue's logo now under your leadership is it the synagogue without walls?
That was one of our projects, the synagogue with no walls. Yes,
no walls. And I wonder, what are, in the 2 minutes we have left, what are some of the lasting? I know you're in your process of grief for Rabbi Sachs's death. I think as a community we all are. What are the main lessons that you're going to hold on to and that you think we can learn from and try to amplify in our lives in memory of Rabbi Sachs's life?
Yeah. I'm processing still that one of the greatest messages I think he writes about and that he spoke about constantly was a sense of taking responsibility. That we can't blame others for our failings, our shortcomings, our mistakes. And there are a number of essays in his Covenants and Conversation at the very end of the Torah on Ha'azinu, I believe they're found, where he speaks at his sometimes most powerful, speaking about how the buck stops with us. No one else is responsible for your shortcomings, mistakes, errors, and failures. It should not be debilitating, it should not be something paralyzing. You can, in a healthy way, pick yourself back up, redouble your efforts, accept that you've done wrong and failed, and now try to make better. But ultimately, we must be accountable to ourselves and not live our lives with a sense of excuses. I think that's one of the greatest messages that I am reminded of by him. You're actually encouraging me to write again another short post. I think I'm going to touch on some of the themes that I just said. And the second theme that I think is one of the greatest takeaways is we are all able to make a difference. And it doesn't have to be a grandiose gesture of saving the world. We don't have to create galaxies. We don't have to shape human history. Can I share with you just one? Can I share with you? This is, sure. I heard this from Rabbi Sachs. He says, if you take a look at Psalms, Tehillim, chapter Kuf Mem Zayin, chapter 147, I was sharing this earlier with a beloved Chevruta. It opens, Bonei Yerushalayim Hashem Nidche Yisrael Yachanes. The builder of Jerusalem is God. He gathers the exiles of Israel. This is God as he appears in human history. And Rabbi Sachs says, if you look a couple of lines later, Moneh Mispar Lekochavim, he counts the number of all of the stars, Lekulam Shemot Yikra, he calls each of them by name. This is God as the creator of the universe. So we have two different ways of looking at God. The creator of the universe and the God who impacts human history. We might not be able to create universes, and we might not be placed to be able to make a significant bend in in the reality of human history. However, if you take a look in the middle verse, Rabbi Sachs went on to say, there's a verse in between those two. And the verse says, who is God? Not only is he a creator of universes, not only is he the redeemer involved in human history, Harofer lishburei lev, Machabesh la'atzvotam. God is the healer of the brokenhearted, winding up their sorrows. Each and every one of us is able to help the brokenhearted. Each and every one of us is able to bind up the sorrows of someone that we may know that comes into our orbit, somebody that we can have an impact on.
Yeah.
And I think the final, perhaps greatest legacy of Rabbi Sachs is there is no deed that is too small. There is no deed that is insignificant. There is no act that cannot, in some particular way, carry its own redemption.
Yeah.
And that is one of the key messages that I will be continuing to carry with me from his works and his thought.
Yeah. As we close out today's session, I'm thinking about the words from the Kel Mali Rachamim, the memorial prayer of Tehei Nishmotehem Surot B'Tzra Chaim, that the souls of our loved ones should be bound up in the bonds of life. And I think to that point you just made of how each person can have an impact with each action, and that is cosmic and is metaphysically significant and spiritually significant and pragmatically significant for the one person who that action impacts. And when we think about keeping someone's soul bound up in the bonds of life, right, each time we are influenced directly or indirectly by their legacy to do one thing that is good or do one thing in a better way, that is continuing to live on their legacy. And Rabbi Sachs has left an enormous legacy for us to live with, and for him to live on through each of our actions as well.
Yeah,
it's really an honor to hear your perspective and the impact he's had on you. And may his neshama, thank you, and Yehi Zichro Baruch, may his memory be a blessing for all of us.
Amen. Thank you so much for inviting me on to come and speak with you. I feel incredibly honored and proud to share this platform with you. May you continue to do wonderful work in Oakland, California. May you feel truly the presence of the divine presence blessing the work of your hands. And may you and your family be healthy and well. We should continue meeting on happier occasions.
Amen. Gam Lamar, and may the winter cold not be too intense in Montreal this year.
Yeah, I'm not so optimistic.
Thank you.
Great seeing you. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
And thanks everyone for joining us. May we continue to share in smachot.
Amen.
Thanks, Rabbi Fishman.
Bye.